Hello, everyone. My name is Lionel Sandner from Pembroke Publishers, and I'll be your host for today's session. Thanks for joining us on this, which I think across the country is a pretty nice day everywhere in August. We appreciate you taking the time to come and hear our speakers today. And with that, I would like to introduce our first speaker, Mary Fiore. And Mary is a curriculum and instructional leader who works collaboratively with both educators and numerous associations to explore innovative ways to improve student achievement in mathematics. In her current role, she assumes responsibility for curriculum implementation and effective teaching practices with a focus on mathematical thinking. Mary has participated in a variety of writing projects that focus on learning and teaching, thinking differently about mathematics, and making student thinking visible. And I know that mathematics is big across the country, and especially for those of you joining us from Mary's home province, Ontario, it's probably even a bigger issue as we move into this rather unusual school year. So I think today's session is timely and going to be helpful for everyone here. So Mary, it's great to have you here. Thanks for taking the time today to join us. And I'll pass the virtual mic over to you.
Thank you, Lionel. Thank you for the introduction, and a warm welcome to all of you joining us this evening, a few days before we're about to embark on a new school year. It's a little bit of a different school year, so it's a very exciting time because we're looking forward to new relationships and new experiences. But there seems to be a little bit of a different feel this year. I guess it's just because there's just so much uncertainty, and we're entering into what appears to be a little bit of unfamiliar territory. So as teachers, we have so many different types of knowledge, and we have specific ways of doing, and we have specific ways of being, and we're really going to have to rely on our ways of being, and specifically referring to being empathetic and compassionate and being adaptive and responsive as we welcome our new friends into the classroom. And I know that over the next little while, I'm confident that many of us are going to spend much of our time making sense of this new way of doing. And I'm hoping that these presentations today with myself and with Kevin are going to support you along your professional journeys over the next couple of weeks. So a couple weeks ago, I attended Kathy Lundy's webinar where she talked about classrooms as places where students are, their communities. And she talked about how important it is for us constantly having to have students notice things, reflect on things, become aware of their conscience, aware of their ethics, and aware of what is fair for themselves and others. And I thought, wow, that's pretty powerful, because that's exactly what Ryan and I try to capture in this book. And it's parallel to what Kathy said, but it's not about students having to constantly, it's about teachers having to constantly notice things, reflect on things, and become aware of what's there for both themselves and their students. So in other words, noticing and reflecting are so interconnected. And I'm noticing things, but then I'm reflecting on what it is that I'm noticing so that I can better make sense of who my learners are. And once I know where my learners are at and what their strengths are and what their interests are and what their needs are, then I can then focus on what is it that I need to do? What is it that I need to learn about and do differently? So I thought it was really interesting that Kathy had said that, and I captured, and I thought, wow, that's really exactly what we try to do in our book as well. So reflection is a big part of what we do. And when I think about the whole idea of reflecting, I can't help but go back to what Dewey said. And he said, we don't learn from experience, we learn from reflecting on experience. But I'm going to extend that a little bit, and something that Ryan and I try to do. It's about reflecting on experience, but it's reflecting during experience as well. So one of the things that we're doing in the classroom is we're thinking about how did the lesson go? What did I do? What worked well? What might I do differently? But we're also focusing on in the moment experience. And that's why that whole idea of noticing and reflecting on during experience is really, really important. So throughout the book, readers have ample opportunities to reflect on their own thinking about teaching and learning, to think about how they might reflect on what it is that their students are thinking and what it is that their students understand. So I'm just inviting you right now. This is an opportunity for you to reflect on two scenarios, and they represent two very different classroom settings. But I'll invite all of you now just to think about, if you were a student, which scenario would you want to be a part of and why? And if you are a teacher, which would you want to be a part of and why? So just a few moments to reflect. So the scenario on the right, it only captures a snapshot of what represents a meaningful learning experience, and those that we strive to create for our students and the ones that our students want to be a part of. And the intent is to focus on those types of experience where students are engaging in mathematical thinking. In other words, they're learning through mathematical thinking to develop that sense of number. And when students have that unique sense of number, they're able to, they're more flexible with their thinking. They're more intuitive with their thinking. So one of the things that when we were working on this, we really made connections between number sense and what the NCTM refers to as mathematical proficiency. So when students are mathematically proficient, they're demonstrating a conceptual understanding, they're demonstrating a procedural understanding, they're able to represent and solve mathematical problems, and I'm pretty sure that the NCTM refers to that as strategic competence. And they're also able to think logically about relationships between different concepts. And they're able to perceive mathematics as both useful and worthwhile. So we made those connections to number sense. And to further that thought, when students are engaging intuitive thought, they're able to look at that image, and students will intuitively say, well, that pail on the left definitely holds a lot more. I may not even know why. I may not have done a calculation. I just know. So when students have that sense of number, they're really relying on their intuition. And they're also, again, being very flexible when they're computing, when they're estimating, when they're making those judgments. And again, the intent of number sense is that they're really truly building an understanding of key number concepts. So what we've really focused on in the book is those concepts of quantity, counting, relating, and representing. So bringing us back to mathematical thinking. So we're learning through mathematical thinking to make sense of number. And when we're engaging in mathematical thinking, and we're going to get a little bit deeper into this in a moment, but this again is an opportunity for you to reflect on, what is it that I mean by mathematical thinking? So we know that we're supposed to teach through mathematical thinking. We know what it is, but we're really going to be focusing on, well, what does it even look like in the classroom? So here's an example. You're more than welcome to do the math off to the side if you wish. I'm just going to give you a few seconds to think about it. But thinking about, if this is the question, so the question is, describe a linear growing pattern and describe how you know it's linear. So this is a question that we would give to our students, and just think about, as an educator, what is it that you're hoping to see if you're looking for evidence of mathematical thinking? So I'll just give you a few minutes to think about that. So here's an example of a possible student solution. And so you've had a moment to think about what it is you might be looking for. And again, this is that whole idea of being able to, where am I noticing the thinking? Now, we recognize that the student isn't here, so we can't ask the student any questions. The thinking was represented using paper. So we've got that very important job because we're not always engaging in these conversations. So knowing what we know about mathematical thinking, where is there evidence of mathematical thinking? And more importantly, how do we know it's mathematical thinking? So where's the evidence of it and what makes us say that? So for example, I could say, well, I'm looking at the student solution and I think the student must have reflected on a previous learning experience because they created a graph. So that's an example of, I think they're engaging in some reflection. So what other types of mathematical thinking skills do you see evident in that sample? So some of the things that you may have considered was, well, they seem to be making connections between what they know about term number and the value of the term. They're making connections between different representations. So they're reflecting on their prior knowledge. You might even say, well, I think there's some evidence of them making a generalization because they were able to articulate what it is that they were doing. So they started with 5 and they added 2 each time. So they created a generalization. So when students are engaging in mathematical thinking, they're doing all these different things. And I had a conversation with a teacher a couple weeks ago, and we were just talking about, well, how would you describe mathematical thinking? And she said, it's all that awesomeness inside their minds that I sometimes can't make sense of. And she just said it so beautifully, because these are those thinking skills and those mental actions, or those habits of mind that they're often, mathematical thinking is often referred to as, that we don't necessarily see it on paper, but we have that important job of noticing and looking for it. So these are just some of the things that students are doing, some of that awesomeness that's going on inside their minds when they're engaging in problem solving and when they're engaging in activities that provide them with opportunities to make sense of number. So the other thing that Ryan and I really focused on in the book, and we had a really difficult time separating assessment from instruction. So we recognize that there's many conversations about effective instructional practices, and there's many conversations about effective assessment practices, but we really felt that it was almost impossible for us to separate the two when we were trying to make sense of what does it mean when I'm noticing and reflecting on student thinking and their understanding of number. And that is why we've explicitly made them inseparable. So that's one of the things that guided our work. And integral to that is when we're engaging and noticing, that's supporting our assessment practices. So when we're talking about what are those effective assessment practices, we are talking about noticing. So we kind of made sense of what mathematical thinking is. So when we're talking about professional noticing, and I would like to add too that it's commonly referred to as teacher noticing. So if you're doing some of your own literature review and you're doing some researching, it is often referred to as teacher noticing. So Ryan and I, we've adapted a model, and we really focused on, well, it's about noticing student thinking or attending, but then I need to be able to interpret that student thinking and understanding. But we also need to make sure that we confirm our interpretations. What I'm thinking about Lionel's thinking, is it really correct? So that point of confirming is when we're asking those questions and we're trying to elicit student thinking even further. And then now that I've confirmed my interpretation, now I can decide, well, how am I going to respond? So throughout the book, we're really focusing on, I guess you could call this a bit of a framework. So, and the intent is, and we didn't call it an assessment framework, but the intent of noticing is part of those assessment practices. So one of the, you'll notice that there's so many different examples that follow this framework. And throughout the book, we've included specific, what we call meaningful learning experiences. So, and of course they include the use of very clear learning intentions or learning goals. They also identify specific success criteria. And again, the intent is by using this framework, and we're not at all implying that it's linear, but it's all those things that we're thinking about when we're creating those meaningful learning experiences before we can take the opportunity to stop and notice and reflect. The other thing that we really explicitly embedded is, what is it that I know about my learner, and what is it that I want my learner to know? So once I've got an understanding of my learning intention, what it is that I'm looking for, what I know about my learner, then selecting a task becomes less challenging. So this is an example of a question that we would present to students, and we call, again, we refer to them as meaningful learning experiences throughout the book, because there's so many incredible questions out there, and they're incredible for a lot of different reasons. But Ryan and I felt that we really needed to focus on, but it's the entire learning experience that makes it very valuable and very meaningful to both students and teachers. So the question on its own, it's necessary, but is it sufficient? We like to think, well, there's a lot of other things that are going on in the background in order to make this learning experience very valuable. So what we've done, we've also included examples of student thinking and teacher thinking. And again, the intent there is no different than assessment and instruction being considered as two separate, inseparable identities. The student thinking and the teacher thinking is inseparable as well. So as a classroom teacher, I'm listening to what students are saying. I'm looking for what they are doing. Like what are their gestures? So we're paying attention to their gestures. So we might see them place a little check mark on the line, or we might see them number something. And then they're also representing their thinking. Again, in this example is paper and pencil, but then all those, the entire time, it's like, well, what am I noticing? And what am I interpreting? So if I go back to that question, and I see students put little check marks on there, I'm making an interpretation. Well, I'm wondering if they're using benchmarks. And that's my interpretation of it. But then I'm going to ask my students, well, how did that one help you? What do these little tick marks represent? And when I have that confirmation, then I'm able to respond to the students. And by responding, it's how am I extending their thinking further, or what is it that I'm going to do the following day? So that's kind of the premise of the way that we've structured our learning experiences. And again, not at all implying that it's linear, but it's a whole cohesive, I guess, kind of way of thinking about teaching and learning. So again, going back to the teaching and learning of mathematics, teachers require different types of knowledge. And Deborah Ball just says this so beautifully in one of her videos. And she says teachers need to have first and foremost knowledge of their students, which is why we really focused on what is it that I know about my learner? What is it that I need to know? We need to have knowledge of pedagogy, which is why we incorporated the use of learning goals and success criteria and those assessment strategies that are going to help us better understand our students as learners, as thinkers. And we have that specific type of knowledge that's unique to the teaching and learning of math, and we often call that content knowledge for teaching. And I guess our vision for the book is that we were providing readers with an opportunity to engage in reflection, reflect on what it is that they're doing, what they could be doing differently. And the intent is adopting that noticing framework to help teachers gather evidence of student thinking and learning, which again supports all of our assessment practices. So that's kind of it in a nutshell. And I once again want to thank everyone. And I'm going to say, well, I guess we're going to have a little bit of a question and answer period. But I do want to thank all of you. And I wish you the best of experiences over the next couple of weeks.
Thank you, Mary. That was great. As you were talking, I was, you can't help but reflect on the new normal that we're heading into, I saw the tools that are in your book, and I like the idea of the student thinking and what is the teacher thinking. Like, that seems really practical to me. But does that change when we're in a virtual world and noticing? I think you can still do it, virtually, but it seems like it's a lot more of a challenge than maybe what you were thinking when the book was written. Is that kind of a fair? Any thoughts on that? Or
You raise a very, very important point, Lionel, and I think this is where I'm going to bring it back to. We might be making interpretations. So a student might post something, for example, on Seesaw. So that's one of the platforms that many of our students, or on Google, through Google Classroom. And we're really, especially more than ever, really going to spend that time confirming what I think I'm seeing, because I'm not in the classroom. I might not be there as the child is working asynchronously. So I might have to spend that extra bit of time confirming it, which is where what are those questions that I'm going to ask? Because sometimes we think we see things, but are we really seeing what we think we're seeing? So during this virtual platform, whether the children are submitting an audio recording or a video recording, that follow-up piece is going to be more important now than ever. Yeah.
And it's funny, I never thought of it that way, right? But you're going to have this time, probably this individual time, and it's noticing and reflecting time when you're with them, kind of one-on-one. But it's like you and me right now, right? Very different. Yeah. Good. Well, thank you very much. That was great. And, on behalf of everyone here today, thank you for sharing some insight into your new resource, and, congratulations on the book. That's always an achievement on its own. So thank you. And we'll transition here, folks, and it'll just take a second to do a change of the slide deck and change of the cameras, and through the magic of technology, though of course it isn't magic, we'll have our next presenter show up, and there he is. Kevin, I'll just do a quick sound check. You're okay?
If you can hear me, I'm okay.
We're good. Good stuff. Great.
Sound good?
Yeah, sound perfect. That's great. Good. Just a reminder, folks, I did make a note there that because cameras and microphones are turned off, if you do have a question, feel free to drop it into the chat, and we'd love to hear from you as our presentations continue. So I'm very pleased to introduce our second presenter today at the Pembroke Publishers webinar, and that is author Kevin Bird. And Kevin Bird is a former assistant superintendent and principal committed to helping teachers reach vulnerable students and helping school districts build better systems for supporting learning. Kevin, along with his co-author, Kirk Savage, speak regularly on teaching and learning practices, especially in the areas of literacy and numeracy. So he comes to us well-positioned today to bring some of his thinking around mathematics. Just to give you a little bit of background information on Kevin, what he does outside of some of his busy time in supporting teachers. The part I think that's really cool is a former water ski coach, which means you must have also water skied at the same time. So you probably bounced around in days in the past a lot better than you do now, at least if you're anything like I am when it comes to water skiing. He spends his leisure time playing hockey, taking care of his wife's horses, mountain biking with his son, and driving his daughter to gymnastics. Though I suspect some of that's changed a little bit over the last few months, but very busy both professionally and personally. So Kevin, thanks for taking the time to join us today, and we're looking forward to our session with you.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you so very much. All right, so the first slide is really just about, I'm going to say me, but it's actually about us, because I've done this work with a co-author, my good friend Kirk Savage, who couldn't be on with us today as he's got a unavoidable ministry meeting. There's a lot of ministry meetings happening right now, as you can probably well imagine, with our potential kickoff to the school year happening. All right, so done some teacher stuff, some principal stuff, some senior management stuff, and one of the sort of different kind of roles that I've been able to take on is being a bit of a consultant with our Ministry of Education here, which is really interesting work mostly in the assessment area, a little bit in curriculum, and then some other areas as well. But it's really interesting to be on the inside of some of those discussions that take place at that level. So that's me. And our two books there. So it's funny that Lionel mentioned the water ski school. I didn't know he was going to do that, but it's a good lead into this little story I want to tell you. And this kind of explains for Kirk and I why some of the work that we do around numeracy assessment is so important to us. And so back in my water ski school, we had purchased one of these boats. Now, if you're not into sailing, this isn't a ski boat. This is a sailboat. And it's a 17-foot Hobie Cat. This isn't the exact one that we had, but it was the best I could do for a picture. And these are extremely quick vessels, and normally they look something like that, sailing away down the lake. They're so fast, they're about twice as fast as a regular sailboat. In fact, they're so fast that once I did actually pull a water skier behind it for a show that we were doing, the wind and waves were too strong to actually do regular water skiing, so we broke out our sailboat and towed a skier past the audience with that. So one day, some of my staff decided to take our boat out, and it was a giant storm on Lake Okanagan. Now, for those who have been to Lake Okanagan, you know that it runs south-north in the interior of BC. And because of its location, the wind that can occasionally come howling through can hit very, very high speeds, and it can throw up giant waves in the middle of the lake. So big, in fact, that in one of the big storms, it actually wiped out one of the city beaches because the waves just carved the sand completely out from the beach. So it was one of those kind of days, and that's why the staff weren't water skiing or teaching kids to water ski, because the water was just too bad. So they decided to take the boat out. As you can see, you kind of lean out over the side to keep it balanced. And while they were doing that, they fell off, and the boat flipped over, looking something more like that in the raging wind. Now, the sail was up, almost impossible to get that tipped back over, and they were struggling with it. So I and a buddy of mine went out in a ski boat to rescue them, and they hopped into the ski boat, and then I got onto the sailboat, very much like what this fellow's doing in the photo there. And you can see he's got a little rope, and he's going to try to lean back on that rope to bring the boat upright. Unfortunately, with the sail in the water and the waves pounding on it, there was no way to do that. So my buddies maneuvered the ski boat around to the top of the mast, and then sort of lifted the mast out of the water and sort of flipped it at the same time I leaned back in order to get the sail out of the water, which lets the pontoons fall back into the water. And it worked brilliantly. So the boat comes back, settles down. I'm sort of in between the two pontoons. And there was a moment of elation that we'd succeeded. And then that quickly turned into completely different emotion, as there was a sudden snapping, banging noise. And the sail, the rope had caught on something, and the sail managed to set itself perfectly in the blowing gale of wind. Also, at the back of the boat, you see there's a giant sort of bar there, and that's actually the tiller, where you control the direction of the boat. Now, the tiller bar had popped off into the lake. So when the wind caught the sail, and it happened to be set perfectly for that direction of wind, and with the tiller bar popped off into the lake, the boat began to accelerate at quite a high rate of speed. And normally what would happen is it would just turn away from the wind. But with the rudder with the rudders being held perfectly in the right direction, it just kept the perfect direction, kept the wind in the sail, and it started accelerating down the lake. Now, for me, in between the two pontoons, it looked something pretty much like that. And where I was actually right hanging on, I think, right there. As the boat accelerated down the lake, I was hanging off the mast and that little metal beam in between the two pontoons, trying to figure out what to do in this situation. Impossible to drag myself up onto the boat because the speed was so great that the resistance to the water was too much. And so I ended up having to let go and kind of flip around and watch my sailboat accelerate away from me in the wind and the waves. My buddies had an anxious moment in the ski boat because, of course, they couldn't see me, and all they saw was the sailboat take off, and there was no sign of Kevin anywhere for the first couple of minutes until I had let go. They whipped up beside me. My buddy grabbed me out of there's something about adrenaline going. He managed to dry lift me right out of the lake and throw me on the bottom of the boat, and we took off after the sailboat, which was by this time a long ways down the lake. Now, here's where this gets interesting for our purposes today, because that boat was sailing itself incredibly well. It managed to go at a very high speed. The tiller was locked in the right position. And if you were to see that boat from a distance, you'd think, hey, there's somebody sailing along rather well down the lake. The problem is that in the middle of Okanagan Lake, there is a floating bridge. Now, this isn't the actual floating bridge, but it's very similar to this. I just needed something with some waves banging against it to show what was going to happen. So this boat that was sailing itself perfectly down the lake was headed right into this. And of course, as soon as it hit that, it would be completely done. And so it was locked into that course, and nothing was going to alter that. So we chased after it with the ski boat, and our sailboat did its best to not be captured. It was kind of weaving just enough to keep us in the wind and the waves, having to sort of dart up to it and then dart away as it cut back at us. And eventually we managed to pull alongside, and I managed to jump out of the ski boat and then onto the wing and then down onto the sailboat and get control of it, and then sail it back up the lake towards our place where our water ski school was. So what does that have to do with what I'm going to talk about today, which is numeracy assessment, and give you a little taste of the ANIE and what's in the book and how that might work for you, is that boat was completely locked into its course, and that course was leading into a place of nothing good. I think one of the things that's a little bit soul-crushing as I look around our province and indeed around Canada is watching numeracy scores on a steady downwards trend for the most part throughout the country province. I think also we can all think of students who are very much like this boat, in that the forces of nature, be they social economics or whatever the case is, are just driving them towards the point where they're not going to be successful. Maybe they drop out or whatever the case is. And math has a big part to do with future success. We've done quite a bit of research in BC around this, and we've got some really strong predictors in grade 4 about whether a student is going to be successful or not. So we know in grade 4 whether a child is going to graduate already with really, really good accuracy. So basically we know whether they're sailing down the lake in the right direction or whether they're sailing down into a barrier that's going to take them out. And yet, what can we do about it? So the work that Kirk and I have done is really around some of the things that have been successful in making sure that that boat doesn't head in that direction and be completely undone. So that brings us to my quick little goal here today, is to tell you a little bit about the ANIE and the supporting conceptual framework. A quick little question, just something to think about. Here's something we do in around grade 7. -2 times -4 equals +8. It's crazy, right? That you take two negative numbers, you multiply them together and get a positive. And what we ask people to do is to try to think of a real life example where this takes place, where you have -2 times -4 equals 8. And I'll give you just a second to do that, to see if you can come up with a real life example. If we were together, we could talk about your examples that you came up with. But for now, I'm just going to get you to hold it in your head. So -2 times -4 equals +8. Now, like I say, we teach this in grade 7, and I'll see if I can remember the rhyme. Ours is not to reason why, just reverse and multiply is what happens when we have these rhymes that help us remember some of these rules. How much better is it to actually be able to understand why the numbers work that way in real life? And so much of the work that Kirk and I do between our 2 books, and then of course our teaching when we go to conferences and stuff like that, is around authentic application for everything that we do, that we're teaching kids, whatever they happen to be. So I'm going to get you to hold on to your real life application if you manage to come up with one. If you didn't, don't worry about it, because the reality is we've put this question to literally hundreds, well, probably thousands of people now in conferences or whatever the situation is. And very rarely, I would say less than 1% or 1% of time, do people come up with an actual viable solution for this. In fact, we had a mathematician tell us once that there is no viable real life application for this. It just has to be because of the way other numbers work. So if you didn't come up with one, don't worry about it. But if you did, you might want to toss it into the comment section there at some point, or whatever the case is. So a couple of the underlying things around the work that we've done. All our work is centered on a balanced approach. Now, balance doesn't mean spending equal time on things. It just means having all of these types of things in a program. And so anything that we're going to learn can be broken down into 3 areas. There's the skill. There's the fluency, or your ability to automatically use those skills, and comprehension. And so when we look at balanced numeracy, there we have comprehension, so conceptual understanding, application, traditional problem solving skills, algorithms, procedures, processes, traditional calculating, and fluency. Our ability to do those things fast enough that our brain can keep track of what we're doing. Sort of like riding a bike. You don't ride a bike fast enough, you fall off. And so fluency is really important. And we can take anything that we might want to learn and apply those same 3 things to it. So I'm just going to give you an example. So there's balanced numeracy, balanced literacy, same deal. Shooting a jump shot in basketball, same thing. It's the skill, it's knowing when to do it and how to use it, which is a comprehension piece, and it's the fluency piece of that practice, that repetitive practice that produces the outcome. Social responsibility is the same thing too. You've got your skill sets, your ability to use those skill sets, and then the comprehension of which things you want to be doing at any one time. And the output from all of these things is what you do in real life, or the authentic application of those skills. So what's interesting is I've taken those triangles and I've sort of put them together to show something here. So if we have numeracy on the right-hand side, at least it's the right-hand side for me, I assume it is for you too. You have your skills, your number work, your fluency, and your comprehension. And then what's interesting is all of these triangles attach together at the comprehension side. So you have your skills and your fluency for literacy, and then they attach together the comprehension side of things. And so those comprehension skills that are shared throughout whatever we're doing, we like to use the I3 model for that, and it explains that what comprehension is made up of, or can be thought to be made up of, is 3 components. There's the image that we build in our head, there's the inferences we draw out of those images, and then that leads to an interpretation, or a big idea that helps us plan what we're going to do and what we're going to think about certain things and things like that. This model can be really helpful when it comes to working with students who are struggling. One of our points of research with struggling students is really focused on building their ability to image. And it's really incredible when you have students who struggle, and it can be a struggle in any area, maybe it's a struggle in behavior or whatever the case is, and you do some imaging work with them to build those skills, how quickly other things improve for them. Imaging work might be something like PWIM, picture word induction method, or something like that to build up those skills. So in the area of numeracy assessment, we've done sort of the background pieces. You've seen the sort of 3-legged stool, or the 3 parts that make up learning. And so when we first set about this work about 15-ish years ago, we looked at all the assessments that we could find out there for numeracy and sort of realized that they sort of came down to 2 categories: legitimacy by volume or legitimacy by complexity. In other words, they got their value by either using volume. So we're going to ask 20 questions, you get 2 wrong, that's 18 out of 20. It's basically the same question over and over again with some minor variations, and eventually with a number of questions, a couple of mistakes are made, and that is what splits kids out into the bell curve. Or complexity. So this is what our provincial assessments are based on, is complexity. So we ask the question, and then in order to split the kids out on a bell curve, we just increase the complexity of the language or the complexity of the task, and that naturally separates kids out. Now, it's not that there's anything the matter with these assessments. It's important to recognize what they're actually testing. And so if you're testing complexity, you're actually working a bunch of literacy skills and stuff like that too. And that's fine as long as it's recognized and realizing that that's not a pure numeracy piece. Interestingly, our provincial assessment data really shows this, that if there's a direct reflection between the literacy scores of any group of kids and the numeracy scores. And the numeracy scores are always just slightly behind for the most part, because of course the kids with poor literacy can't accomplish the task, so they're not going to get it. And then there's a couple of kids who also struggle with the math part, so they always just trail just a little bit behind those reading scores, generally speaking. Open versus closed skill, a really important concept. So I was kind of hoping actually that I'd be able to put a Calgary player in here or a Toronto player in here or something like that, but unfortunately I can't because only the Canucks are left in the playoffs. Sorry about that. So this is one of our players. He's practicing. So that's a closed skill. Nothing else is going on except for him practicing his shot. And if you're following the playoffs, you realize that that practice is paying off. So that's the closed skill. And then there's the open skill, when you're using those closed skills in a game situation where you've got a goalie, you've got all kinds of things happening around you. And so it's an open task. So the ANIE, it demonstrates open skills to show mastery, pinpoints issues preventing mastery. It's performance standards based. We have these things in BC called performance standards. They're basically a rubric for numeracy, literacy, and social responsibility. It focuses on one question, and we call this the doorway question, and it's an important concept. So instead of asking a bunch of different questions and building complexity in those questions, the ANIE has the teacher choose a question that best represents the learning. So if I'm teaching addition of two numbers by one number, I just choose a question that represents that. And then the student will use that question to show mastery. ANIE has a bunch of skills linked together, and that has to do with templating. So, and something called myelination. So cells that wire together, fire together is a term that refers to the idea that when we do a bunch of skills together, that actually wires those things in our head, so that as soon as we start any piece of that skill, it all fires together. And so when I show you the template, that's going to be an important thing to remember. And then upside down problem solving is what the ANIE is based on. So generally speaking, a traditional word problem, you read the word problem, you decide on key information, et cetera, and then eventually you end up at the solution. ANIE actually works the opposite way. So you start out with your doorway question, the simple calculation, say 25 plus 4 or something like that. You make an estimate if that's possible with the particular question. You do a calculation. You do a representation that's some picture related and word related, and then you apply the concept in real life is the general format. General format is used there's a bunch of different templates. Here's the actual ANIE template, and I'll go through it in just some detail here. So at the top, you'd write in your problem. So say you're doing simple multiplication, 32 times 5 might be what's there. The next portion is to make your best guess. So maybe the student does an estimation of 30 times 5 just because it's a little bit easier. 3 times 5, it makes it a little bit easier. Estimating is really important because you actually use a completely different part of your brain for estimating than you do for calculating. Calculating is a logic language-based thing. Estimating is an imaging picture-based thing. So it's important to have that in there if the question lends itself to an estimate. Obviously, if the question is 2 plus 3, an estimate probably isn't what you're going to do there. But for most questions, there is an estimate that can come out. Next, you calculate. This can be done using sort of the standard kind of calculation. We always ask people to do a couple here if we need to push them a bit. So showing different ways of calculating, at least one way of calculating. And then draw or sketch. Different templates use different language here, but draw or sketch your solution. And then explain your calculation in Sketch in language, and then give an example of how the math is used in real life, which is incredibly important. And so very often when students encounter this for the first time, they talk about, oh, well, I would use this math in class, or I'd use this math with money. And this is really an area where you can really push kids in a couple of directions. First of all, using it in their real life so that they're bringing their own background to this. This is really important. Like in BC, we're working really hard at Indigenous learning in our education. And this is a way that an Indigenous learner can bring their learning into the classroom in a really sophisticated way. So what are the examples from your own life where this math would apply? Another way of pushing kids is having them use the exact numbers from the question. So, if you had a question like 4,583 plus 9,832, and the example is, well, I have 4,500 whatever marbles, and I add another 9,000. Well, I can push that kid along really easily by saying, hey, really? That's how many marbles you have? Can you, well, I work in a marble factory. Well, great. That would make sense. But pushing kids along and so that they are using those numbers in a sense that is real. Now, when I say real, I don't necessarily mean not fantastical, because of course unicorns and aliens and all those kind of things can be used. But again, making sense of the numbers is important. So it just as an example, we're working with one child, and he'd been working in the millions, and he had sort of 2 million minus 1 million or whatever it was, and he had $1 million left over. And his example was, okay, well, I had $2 million, but I lost $1 million in the stock market, but I have $1 million left, so I can buy a really cheap house in Vancouver. And that shows pretty sophisticated understanding of the size of those numbers and stuff like that. You can see the rubric just down at the bottom. Here's one that's filled out. Of course, if we were in a workshop, we'd go through a bunch of these and look at students. It kind of goes to what Mary was talking about really looking at the thinking of what students are doing. And we find that this template really gives us access to that thinking in a consistent way with students, especially if you're going to be working in a distance thing. Like if you have a chance to go over these templates and the kids are really familiar with it. Our research classrooms really found this really useful when it switched to a distance thing, because the kids were so familiar with the template. All you're doing is changing those questions, and so you're instructing in the math and not instructing in how to do the actual work. Well, does any work? Just throwing in some quick data graphs here. This is a grade 4 pilot school. This is from years and years and years ago when they were a pilot school for some of the programming. There's our provincial average there. You can see that roughly half the kids are meeting, and then kids fall off on other sides. And you can see that in this rural medium socioeconomic school, you can see how many kids went to the exceeding on the provincially scored assessment. It's really rather remarkable. Next school, this is a grade 7 example, and I don't know about where you guys are from, but in BC, there's something called the 4 to 7 drop-off, where the grade 4s are sort of here, and the grade 7s are always just a little bit lower, generally speaking. Really good districts manage to keep the 7s here. In really strong situations, the 7s even improve above the grade 4s, but there's hardly any of those. So up at the top here is the grade 7 provincial scores, and then you can see through consistent use of the ANIE, you can see the scores now. Muheim, very low socioeconomic school. It was one of the worst ranked schools in the province, and then 2 years later it was within the top 10% of the province, and it's stayed pretty much there since these things. And you can see just how well those students have been doing with this sort of approach to teaching. Now, I've just got some really quick examples just to whip through as we end up here. ANIE is a concept, and the templates are just expressions of those concepts. So this is one that we use with younger kids, and we've also had a lot of success with this with kids who experience autism. So we call it the ANIE Junior, but what the idea is, just some of the language is different. So you guess, you use some numbers, you draw some pictures, and then the real life example is sort of helped out by saying math story. So a beginning, middle, and end math story. And drawn, not necessarily written, depending on the ability of the students. Chilliwack School District here has done a whole bunch of work with this, and they produced a version called Snap, which is great. You can see that it's very, very similar. Just some arrangements and some different language there. And they also have a number sense piece, same sort of concept. You work with one number, And then you sort of break that number down into a bunch of different ways to show your mastery of the understanding of that number. They use it as a classroom assessment, of course, but it's also used as a district assessment. And here's what they're looking for. They want their grade 2s to be able to do addition, subtraction, multiplication, and you see as it goes down. And then the idea is, it's sort of like with reading, like if a kid's not reading by the end of grade 3, right, we're freaking out. Well, really the end of beginning of grade 2, we're freaking out. Same kind of idea. If they don't have their addition facts by the end of grade 2, that's a serious problem, and we need to fix that. Multiplication at the end of grade 4. There's really good research that we're working on right now that shows that if kids don't have multiplication by the end of grade 4, they're likely not to graduate. Speaking of a sailboat locked into its course into a bridge, right? That's one of the key indicators right there. So that's Chilliwack's SNAP, which is this version of the ANIE, is used in a whole bunch of districts here in BC and a couple other places throughout Canada and down in the States as well, as a district type assessment tool. Here's some things that teachers have done. This is a whiteboard with one of those snap pieces on it. This is the ANIE as a concept in a classroom. So this is a teacher who's done a lot of work with a template, and the kids just come in. Maybe this is after recess or whatever the case is, and they just know what to do. Estimate, calculate, check, real life, and boom, boom, boom. And they just work down those things while the teacher does whatever they need to do on the way in. This class that this is from, this teacher gets amazing results in their math through this way. Now here's the sort of ANIE Junior kind of idea done on a whiteboard as well. So that kind of brings me to the end of my time. The goal was to introduce ANIE and some of the supporting framework, and then of course this idea of being in control of those boats and making sure that we don't end up just locking people into their direction. And ANIE is one of those tools that has some really good research behind it that supports that it can get people out of those courses into those things that don't end well. And so maybe you'll give it a try in your situation as well. -2 times -4 equals +8. So we're going to go to Tim Hortons. Coffee costs $2. And so 4 days ago, if we spend $2 a day, so we're -$2 because we're spending it, and we're going back in time by -4 days. That means 4 days ago we had $8 in our pocket, and today we don't have those $8 in our pocket because we were minusing 2 over the course of those 4 days. All right, thanks for listening.
I'm glad you ended that way, Kevin. I've been sitting here thinking about, okay, what is an answer to that particular one? So thank you. Janice asked a question that I was actually writing it down as I think she sort of popped it in there. But that comment you made around being able to multiply by grade 4, is there anything you can direct folks to around the research for that?
Yeah,
I think
so
right?
there's something going on right now. And my colleague is actually working with folks who do some of our data analysis at a provincial level, and actually they're working on this now. I saw a surprise, you could call it a leaked document if you want, for drama's sake, but actually what it is just some of the very early stuff where they've taken literally thousands of now that we've got, because this assessment has been used at a district level in a lot of districts for a period of time, we've got this bucket of data now for the first time. And we've also got our provincial assessment data that at the same time. And when you look at those pieces together, what you're seeing, and it's really interesting that one ANIE with one doorway question is really, really a sophisticated predictor of what's going to happen down the road. So here in BC, actually, our provincial assessments at grade 4 and 7 are incredibly accurate for predicting student success, which is really interesting and really sad at the same time, because we're basically saying these students are going to make it, and we know that really, really early. And so why aren't we doing more about it and all that kind of thing? But it's interesting that there is a direct parallel between student success and that multiplication piece, and that's being expanded on right now. And there'll probably be some interesting, whether they're publications or whatever the case, coming out. You definitely want to follow my buddy Kirk Savage's Twitter account. He's much better at tweeting than I am, and that's the place to see those pieces of research popping out all the time.
Okay, great. And I know we're coming to the top of the hour, near end of our time together, but there's sort of another sort of piece in there that got me thinking a little bit about sort of this new normal we're moving into. And like, I really like the idea in the ANIE around the doorway question, but I also sort of have this sense that as we move to more online stuff, there's going to be this demand that parents see kids doing things, not necessarily maybe learning, but doing. And that idea of legitimacy by volume, we all did, kids did worksheets, multiplication worksheets. Is that a concern of yours? As you sort of move forward here, you're trying to get people to, let's take this doorway question and really get into it, as opposed to just answering,
Yeah.
on 2 times 3 kind of thing. Does that make sense, the question there?
Yeah. So I just want to get back to, I'm just going to hop back to this for a sec, because I think one thing's really important about this. ANIE's program agnostic. It doesn't matter what people do, whether it's Math Makes Sense or JUMP or whatever the case is. I happen to be good friends with John Myden, who created JUMP in the very first place. Have a lot of success with that as a good resource, not a program, but a resource. And so one of the really important things to us is that with ANIE, anybody can find themselves a place in there. And so that skill building, that is that traditional work. There's really no, that traditional teaching, that traditional showing those steps. Something like JUMP does that really well. That fluency piece is multiplication tables over and over and over again, because the only way of building fluency is 90% accuracy practice. It's the only way. It doesn't matter whether you're talking about a slap shot in hockey or shooting a basketball or times tables or whatever it happens to be. That's the only way of getting fluency. And then the comprehension piece, like we talked about. So there's nothing the matter with, we work with tons of people who come to us and say, but I love my mad minutes. And that's great. You can still love your mad minutes. Let's make sure that we're working in these other things too. And what are you doing for imaging in math? And what are you doing for your real life examples and stuff? So it's really important that people are really good at different things. And this is really just supposed to be that reminder to say, oh yeah, I need to do this as well. So I do those things and I do that. And so is there a danger that somebody's program settles on just one of these areas? Absolutely. And I think we see that. But if this sort of balance piece is in the back of people's minds and they're using a template like ANIE, yeah, you can do your multiplication table sheet. Absolutely. It's really important for fluency. You can do some skill building, maybe in that virtual teaching environment with kids or whatever the case is, and then building those comprehension pieces and getting kids to image, infer, and interpret what they're doing is important. So this model for me is really one of the most important understandings that I have in education in general, is just that understanding of this balance piece. And so that I'm always checking my own practice and saying, okay, because I really like doing the comprehension big idea stuff and love it. And so, but am I getting trapped there? Am I doing enough skill building? Am I teaching, paragraph writing or whatever the case is with enough skill? And am I doing enough practice for these kids so that when it comes to the comprehension piece, they have what they need?
Knowing that as a teacher is one thing, but also communicating that to the parents is an important piece as well.
Yeah. So talking about communication to parents, I've been one of the areas where ANIE helps, and I think this is even more true at home, is that we probably had people come in. I ran into it as a principal all the time, where a parent would come in and, well, not all the time, but often enough, where a parent would come in and say, why did my kid get this mark in math? And when the teacher had been doing ANIE regularly and could say, and believe it or not, it was often, my kid has an A in math and I don't think they're strong enough. And the teacher could say, okay, well, here's the 12 ANIEs we've done over this term, and you can see how they're showing their sophisticated answering or whatever the case is, or vice versa. The reason your child doesn't have an A is because, look, their authentic example falls down in these areas. They aren't able to show more than one way of calculating, or whatever it is, right, in keeping with the rubric. And so, again, when you have this templating idea where you're using a very similar format, but what you're teaching changes, but the format stays the same, you can really educate parents on, this is why we do all these pieces together. And somebody using the ANIE can easily point parents to the Savage Bird website, which is on a handout that's going to come out in just a moment. And there's lots of background there for parents to take a look at if they really want to understand what's going on. And then parents, once they see, okay, so this is what this means, and this is how my kid is showing mastery of these skills, it can prove to really short circuit some of those concerns or whatever the case is. The handout that I've got for everybody is, one of the things I didn't get a lot of time to talk about is working with students with special needs, which is something I've done a lot of in my career. And so the handout is the ANIE and how it relates to the RTI model, response to intervention model. And then there's some information on there about websites and Twitters and all those kind of things as well.
Great. Excellent. Good. Well, thank you very much. That was great. I really appreciate you taking the time to explain the ANIE to us and some of the connections. So thank you. Folks, if you're, Kevin just referred to a handout up by the chat. There is another tab for handouts. If you click on that, you should be able to download the handout. I'll also include it in the email that comes out for the recording. There'll be a link to get it there as well. And just as we finish, there will be an opportunity for, if you're interested, you'll notice Pembroke Publishers is offering a $5 off your next purchase, and the code is there is TMN20. If you take that code, or you can click to get to the website for, you taking the time today. It was great to have you here, and hopefully professionally you were able to take some things from both what Mary and Kevin had to say. But there's a lot more of what they were talking about today in both of their books, and please feel free. You can order those online, and we'd be happy if you were able to use the code to help offset some of the cost to that. So Mary, I know you're back in there somewhere there. So Mary and Kevin, again, thank you very much for today. Very informative, and we enjoyed our afternoon with you. So thank you, and have a good evening. And to everyone else, thank you as well. Have a good evening, and please stay tuned as we have more sessions with Pembroke Publishers coming up as we move into September. So thank you.